Chances are, if you're watching this video, then you probably know Huawei. But ask any of your non-techie friends, and they probably won't have a clue, even though they've been around for quite some time and have a really strong presence in the telecommunications market. Overseas, in several different key markets, we know that they have a pretty good established base, especially in China. But what's really interesting though is that Huawei actually trails Apple and Samsung when it comes to global sales for handsets. So in this video, I'm just going to go through some of the highs and the lows that Huawei has gone through since they first came onto the scene here in the US market and where they're headed in the future. So I'm going to go back to 2010, which is actually the first time I actually came across a device from Huawei, but you wouldn't know it was Huawei because it was a white branded device and it was made for AT&T, T-Mobile, but you never really saw Huawei's name or branding on it. Now during those early days, most of Huawei's devices were just basically these cost-conscious alternatives. You could say that they were cheap, but the nice thing about them is that you didn't have to spend a whole lot of money picking them up, which is good in a way because the lower price points will definitely broaden its reach. But at the same time, it really doesn't help when it comes to brand recognition because for starters, when you think of a phone that's low cost, you're going to think it's going to be cheap. And not in the way that you're saving money, but in things like build quality, design, and the choice of materials. The first two devices I remember checking out that were made by Huawei were the AT&T Impulse 4G and the T-Mobile Comet, and they're perfect examples of the low-cost strategy that Huawei was going after when it first bursted onto the scene. But the problem with these devices was that, yes, they were cheap in the sense that their build qualities were questionable, they didn't have the best looking designs, and they were just made out of really cheap materials. So all of that just doesn't really help your brand recognition because people are going to associate your brand as being a low-cost alternative and something that lacks quality control. What's interesting though is that this principle of going after really low-cost devices still applies today with Huawei's strategy, although it has evolved in a different way. Huawei's initial breakthrough success came in mid-2013 when they rolled out the Huawei AscendMate. It featured that phablet form factor that was pretty much being introduced by Samsung and its Galaxy Note. So Huawei's alternative was the AscendMate, and the nice thing about it was that yes, it fit that form factor, but it was at the fraction of the cost. Again, that's basically Huawei's strategy as a whole. Well, that phone was largely a success for them. The problem was, again, visibility here in the US market because it wasn't sold directly here. Instead, consumers had to import it, and that by itself doesn't really help to establish brand recognition here. But things slowly started to develop for Huawei because with the launch of the AscendMate 2, they actually opened up their own online retail channel here in the US. So now they had a hub where consumers who were interested in its phones could purchase it in one place. This has been Huawei's strategy since then because when they announce a phone, chances are you could pick it up through their online website. Eventually, they started opening up to different outlets. They established relationships with many retailers like Amazon and Best Buy, which of course gives them visibility here in the US versus not having anything at all. Well, that's great. There's still a huge opportunity missed because here in the US, we know how it works when it comes to buying cell phones. You go to a carrier store and that's still how it is today. So rather than being sold online or through a website, consumers would have the ability to actually see a device, which in turn will help out their brand recognition and also the brand awareness because now they can actually feel, touch, hold the device in their hands and kind of get acquainted with them. Selling low-cost phones has been Huawei's strategy for a long time. Even when they moved up to mid-range devices, they were still relatively affordable. But in order to really stand out, they needed to go to the next level, and that's going with a flagship device. And that became a reality in the summer of 2013 when they launched the Ascend P6. And it showed us that Huawei was a serious contender because for once, they had a solid device that could compete against things like the iPhone, Samsung Galaxy devices, and all the other flagship Android devices that were being introduced at that time. You had a phone that was premium in its construction and the performance matched that as well. Since then, they've been making some really good high-end phones, but the nice thing about them was that they were still undercutting the competition when it came down to price. Yes, it looked, felt, and also performed very similar to those other flagship devices, but they didn't have necessarily the flagship cost. Moving to flagship territory was a great strategy for Huawei because now they were competing directly against some of the big names out there in the industry. So people were taking notice of this. But you know what? They didn't just stop with smartphones. Huawei eventually decided to branch out to other areas, specifically the Windows PC market. And in 2016, that's what we got when we first saw their Windows 10 tablet, the Huawei MateBook. Moving to the PC market was a logical move by them because it opened up new opportunities and of course, more consumers to really sell its brand to. More recently, at Mobile World Congress this year, they announced the Huawei MateBook X Pro, which is a slick-looking ultrabook which rivals things like the MacBook Air. But again, this is just a strategy for them to evolve and move out to different areas. Even with all that ambition, there's just one thing that's really stalling Huawei from really increasing its brand recognition here in the US, and it's those long-time reports of spying. This shroud has been over their head for a long time now, and that's probably the biggest thing that's preventing them from really taking off here in the US. Now, the spying are just basically allegations at this point, but still, it makes any consumer really second guess about using the device when the government's telling them that they shouldn't. And in some capacity, that could have been the contributing factor into why its deals with Verizon and AT&T most recently didn't go through. Now, you could argue that the doors have been locked for Huawei, but I actually disagree because to me, they have the keys. They have the ability to actually build confidence in consumers to show them exactly what they're all about. Obviously, it's going to be an uphill battle for them. They've encountered this kind of adversity before, and it's going to be really intriguing to see how they respond going forward. I gotta say though, for a company that's still struggling with some brand recognition here in the US, they've come a long way because you look back at where they started at 2010 to where they're at now, they have changed tremendously in that time frame. The landscape has changed, but they evolve accordingly to those changes. For myself though, I gotta admit, I've been really impressed with Huawei's offerings for the last 3 years now. They've proven to me that they're capable of delivering top-notch devices, but still really undercutting the competition when it comes to pricing. So what do you guys think of Huawei? Is it something that you think has a really strong brand recognition here stateside? And where do you think they're going to be in the next few years? You can leave a comment below and I'll definitely check it out and do my best to respond. So if you guys want to learn more about any of the stuff I talked about in this video, you can check out our website, PhoneArena.com. This is John B, signing off.